Sometimes a father's love makes him do impossible things. Jackson Avery stared at his sleeping son and knew he had to risk everything they had left. This widowed black father in 1885, Cedar Ridge, had just spent their final $500 on an abandoned farmhouse that everyone called worthless. The townspeople laughed at him. His neighbors shook their heads. Even his 8-year-old son, Elijah, looked worried as they walked up to the broken front door. Jackson knew people thought he'd lost his mind, but he also knew his boy deserved better than the cold nights they'd been spending in their wagon. As they stepped inside the dusty, empty rooms, Jackson had no idea that beneath the rotting floorboards lay secrets that would change their lives forever. What he found hidden in that forgotten cellar would either save his family or destroy everything he was fighting for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch. As Jackson Avery stood before his new home, clutching a crumpled deed in his calloused hands. The paper felt heavier than it should, weighted with the hopes of a desperate man and the future of his 8-year-old son. Cedar Ridge sprawled behind them, a frontier town that had seen better days, where dust devils danced between buildings, and whispered gossip traveled faster than the morning breeze. "Papa, are you sure about this place?" Elijah's voice carried the wisdom of a child who had grown up too fast. His small hand found Jackson's larger one, fingers intertwining with the natural trust that only exists between father and son. Jackson squeezed gently, feeling the rough calluses on his palms from countless odd jobs that never seemed to pay enough. "Son, sometimes a man has to take a leap of faith. Your mama always said that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward in spite of it." The farmhouse stood before them like a monument to forgotten dreams. Paint peeled from its clapboard siding in long, curling strips that reminded Jackson of old wounds healing. The front steps sagged under the weight of neglect, and several windows were boarded up with weathered planks. But Jackson saw something the townspeople couldn't potential. In his mind's eye, he could already see fresh paint, repaired shutters, and smoke rising from the chimney on cold winter nights. Sarah's wedding ring hung heavy against his chest, suspended on a thin chain beneath his worn cotton shirt. 3 years had passed since fever took her. 3 years of wandering from town to town, taking whatever work he could find while trying to give Elijah some semblance of childhood. The ring was all he had left of the woman who had believed in him when no one else would, who had seen promise in a freed slave trying to make his way in a world that often seemed determined to keep him down. Behind them, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his reverie. Carter Smith, the bank clerk who had handled the auction paperwork, approached with the careful gait of a man who delivered both good news and bad with equal reluctance. Carter was younger than Jackson, perhaps 25, with soft hands and the pale complexion of someone who spent his days indoors with ledgers and documents. "Mr. Avery," Carter called out, his voice carrying across the morning air. "I wanted to make sure you understood the property taxes will be due in 3 months. $67, to be precise." Jackson felt his stomach tighten. $67 might as well have been 67,000 given their current circumstances. But he kept his expression steady, unwilling to show weakness in front of his son or the bank clerk. "I understand, Mr. Smith. We'll manage." Carter's expression softened slightly. He was a good man caught between duty and compassion, a position Jackson knew all too well. There's also the matter of the previous owners. The Henderson family left rather suddenly back in '70. Folks say they were involved in some controversial activities before the war ended. What kind of activities? Jackson asked, though he suspected he already knew. In 1885, the wounds of the Civil War were still fresh, and the Underground Railroad remained a topic people discussed in hushed tones. "The kind that made certain people around here mighty unhappy," Carter replied diplomatically. "Just thought. You should know what you're walking into. Some folks have long memories." As Carter departed, Jackson turned his attention to the task at hand. The front door hung slightly askew on its hinges, and the brass doorknob was green with age. When he turned it, the mechanism protested with a grinding screech that echoed through the empty rooms beyond. The interior revealed itself in layers of dust and abandonment. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the boarded windows, creating patterns on the warped wooden floors. The main room was larger than Jackson had expected, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and built-in shelves that spoke of a family who had once called this place home. Elijah ran ahead, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. "Papa, look, there's stairs going up, and there's another room back here." Jackson followed his son's voice to the kitchen, where a cast-iron stove sat cold and silent. The room felt different, somehow more lived in, more personal. Perhaps it was the way the morning light fell across the worn table, or the faded curtains that still hung at the windows. This was where a family had shared meals, made plans, and faced whatever troubles came their way. "We'll start here, Jackson," decided aloud. "Clean this room first. Get the stove working. A man needs a place to cook for his family." The next few hours passed in a blur of sweeping, scrubbing, and organizing. Jackson had learned long ago that physical work helped quiet the worried voices in his head. Each stroke of the broom, each swipe of the cloth, was a small act of faith in their future. Elijah worked beside him, humming songs his mother had taught him, his presence a constant reminder of what Jackson was fighting for Dot as they worked. Neighbors occasionally passed by on the dusty road. Some waved politely, others simply stared. Jackson was accustomed to being the subject of curious glances. A black man and his son were still an uncommon sight in many frontier communities. But Cedar Ridge had surprised him with its relative acceptance. Perhaps the shared hardships of frontier life made people more willing to judge a man by his character rather than his color dot around midday. Henry Stiles, the general store owner, appeared in the doorway. Henry was a tall, lean man with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen much of the world and found most of it wanting. "Afternoon, Jackson. Thought you might need some supplies to get started." Henry carried a wooden crate filled with basic necessities: soap, candles, coffee, and salt pork. It was a generous gesture from a man who barely knew them, and Jackson felt a surge of gratitude mixed with wariness. In his experience, unexpected kindness often came with unexpected strings attached. "That's mighty kind of you, Henry. What do? I owe you." "We can settle up later," Henry replied, though his eyes seemed to be cataloging every detail of the room. "This old place has quite a history, you know? The Henderson family lived here for near 15 years before they up and disappeared." "One night. Disappeared?" Elijah asked, looking up from the corner where he'd been arranging his few possessions. A wooden horse his father had carved, a picture book his mother had read to him, and a small leather pouch containing smooth stones they'd collected during their travels. Henry's expression grew thoughtful. "Well, maybe disappeared isn't the right word. Left suddenly might be more accurate." Martha Henderson was seen loading a wagon in the dead of night. Then they were gone come morning. Never did find out where they went or why they left so quick. Jackson filed this information away, though he wasn't sure why it seemed important. "Any reason you can think of?" "Times were hard after the war," Henry said carefully. "Some folks weren't too happy about certain activities that might have been going on here. Martha was known to be sympathetic to causes that didn't sit well with everyone in town. But that's old history now. What matters is that you and the boy have a place to call home." After Henry left, Jackson found himself studying the kitchen with new eyes. If the Henderson family had been part of the Underground Railroad, this room might have seen its share of whispered conversations and hurried preparations. The thought filled him with a strange mixture of respect and apprehension. The afternoon brought another visitor. April Kepner, the schoolteacher, arrived at their door carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She was a woman of perhaps 30, with auburn hair pinned back in a practical style and the patient demeanor that came from working with children. Her dress was simple but well-maintained, and her shoes showed the wear of someone who walked considerable distances as part of their daily routine. "I brought you some supper," she said simply. "Figured you might be too busy to cook tonight." Jackson felt heat rise in his cheeks. It had been 3 years since Sarah's death, and he still wasn't accustomed to kindness from unmarried women. "That's very thoughtful, Miss Kepner. Won't you come in?" April stepped into the kitchen and looked around approvingly. "You've made good progress already. This old place just needed someone to care for it again." During supper, fresh bread, beef, stew, and apple pie that tasted like heaven after weeks of trail rations. April asked about Elijah's education. The boy was bright, she observed, but he'd missed considerable schooling due to their travels. She offered to provide extra lessons to help him catch up, an offer that Jackson gratefully accepted. "There's something special about this house," April said as she prepared to leave. "I can feel it. Houses hold memories, you know? Good ones and difficult ones both. But I think this place is ready for good memories again." That night, as Jackson tucked Elijah into a makeshift bed in the main room, his son asked the question that had been on both their minds. "Papa, do you think Mama would like this house?" Jackson sat on the edge of the bed, his hand smoothing Elijah's dark curls. The boy had his mother's eyes and her gentle spirit, though he'd inherited Jackson's stubborn determination. "I think she'd love that we have a real home again, son. She'd love that you'll have a place to grow up, to make friends, to become the man she always knew you could be." "Do you miss her, Papa?" "Every day," Jackson admitted, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "But you know what? She's still with us. In the way you smile, in the questions you ask, in the kindness you show to others. That's how love works, Elijah. It doesn't end when someone goes to heaven. It keeps growing." As his son drifted off to sleep, Jackson walked through their new home by candlelight. The house creaked and settled around him, ancient timbers adjusting to new occupants. In the kitchen, he ran his hand along the worn wooden table, imagining the families who had gathered here before them, the Hendersons sharing meals, making plans, perhaps harboring fugitive slaves on their journey to freedom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, finding steady work, making repairs, earning the money for taxes. But tonight, for the first time in months, Jackson Avery felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. This house, whatever its history, whatever secrets it might hold, was theirs now. A foundation upon which to rebuild their lives. Outside, the wind whispered through the eaves, and Jackson could have sworn he heard something like a welcome in its voice. He touched Sarah's ring through his shirt and made her a silent promise. He would make this work, no matter what it took. Asterisk. The rooster's crow from a neighboring farm pulled Jackson from restless sleep just as the first rays of dawn crept through the gaps in the boarded windows. His back ached from sleeping on the hard floor, but the sight of Elijah curled peacefully in his makeshift bed made every discomfort worthwhile. This was their first full day in their new home, and Jackson intended to make the most of it. After a breakfast of coffee and the biscuits April had left him, Jackson set about making a list of necessary repairs. The roof needed patching, the front steps required reinforcement, and several floorboards throughout the house had begun to rot. Each task would cost money they didn't have, but Jackson had learned to prioritize. Safety first, comfort later. "Papa, what's this?" Elijah's voice called from the kitchen. Jackson found his son kneeling beside the cast-iron stove. running his small fingers along a section of floorboard that seemed different from the others. Where most of the kitchen floor showed the wear patterns of daily foot traffic, this particular board appeared newer, less weathered. "Probably just a repair someone made," Jackson said, though something about the board caught his attention too. The wood grain didn't quite match the surrounding planks, and when he pressed down on it, it felt slightly loose. "It moves, Papa. Look." Elijah pushed on one end of the board, and it tilted like a seesaw. Working together, father and son managed to pry up the board with Jackson's knife. Beneath it lay a small cavity, clearly carved out deliberately. And nestled in that space, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture and decay, was an ornate brass key. Elijah's eyes widened with excitement. "It's like a treasure hunt, Papa." Jackson held the key up to the morning light streaming through the window. It was beautifully crafted, with intricate designs etched into the metal flowers and vines, intertwined with what looked like tiny stars. This wasn't the kind of key used for ordinary doors or simple boxes. Whatever it unlocked was meant to be important, precious even. "What do you think it opens?" Elijah asked, practically bouncing with curiosity. "I don't know, son. But we'll find out." They spent the next hour searching the house methodically. They tried the key in every door, every drawer, every box or trunk they could find. Nothing. Jackson began to wonder if whatever the key unlocked had been taken when the Henderson family departed so suddenly 15 years ago. It was while examining the bedroom that Jackson noticed the scratches. Faint marks in the wooden wall, barely visible unless you knew to look for them. They formed a rough arrow pointing downward toward the floor. But when Jackson examined the floorboards beneath the marks, they appeared solid and undisturbed. "Maybe it points to something in the cellar," Elijah suggested. Jackson hadn't yet explored the cellar thoroughly. The wooden steps leading down from the kitchen were steep and narrow, and the space below was dark as midnight. But armed with a lantern and his son's infectious curiosity, Jackson descended into the depths of his new home. The cellar was larger than he'd expected, with stone walls and a dirt floor. Most of it appeared to be used for root storage, with built-in shelves and bins for preserving vegetables through the winter months. But as Jackson's lantern cast dancing shadows across the space, he noticed something odd about the far wall, where the other walls showed the rough-hewn stones typical of frontier construction. This wall appeared different, smoother, more carefully fitted, and there, at about chest height, was a small keyhole barely visible in the mortar between stones. "Papa, you found it," Elijah whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make their discovery vanish. Jackson's hands trembled slightly as he inserted the brass key. It fit perfectly, turning with a soft click that echoed in the underground chamber. But nothing happened. No door opened. No secret revealed itself. "Maybe you have to push?" Elijah suggested. Jackson pressed against the wall, and to his amazement, an entire section swung inward on hidden hinges. Behind it lay another chamber, smaller than the main cellar, but clearly constructed with great care. The air that emerged carried scents of old wood and something else, something that reminded Jackson of his grandmother's chest, where she kept her most precious belongings. They stepped into the hidden room, and Jackson raised his lantern high. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves sat various containers, wooden boxes, cloth bundles, even a few glass jars sealed with wax. But what captured his attention immediately was the writing on the walls. Names were carved into the stone, dozens of them, accompanied by dates. Freedom March 1863. Safe Passage July 1864. Thank you. August 1865. The initials Mage appeared repeatedly, and Jackson realized they must stand for Martha Henderson. "Papa, what is this place?" Elijah's voice was hushed with awe. "I think this is where people hid, son. people who were running toward freedom. Jackson understood now why the Henderson family had left so suddenly, operating a station on the underground. Railroad had been dangerous work, and even after the war ended, former conductors often faced retribution from those who opposed their activities. As they explored the hidden chamber, Jackson noticed that one of the wooden boxes sat apart from the others, positioned prominently on a central shelf. Unlike the other containers, which appeared to have been left by various travelers, this one bore the careful craftsmanship of someone who had time and skill to invest in its creation. The box was locked, but the brass key opened this as well. Inside, wrapped in silk that still retained hints of its original blue color, Jackson found a leather-bound journal. The cover was embossed with the initials, H, and the first page bore an inscription in elegant handwriting. For those who understand that freedom is worth any price. Martha Henderson, 1870. Jackson opened the journal carefully, aware that he was handling something precious. The pages contained Martha's personal account of her family's work with the Underground Railroad, including detailed descriptions of the people they had helped and the dangers they had faced. But one entry, dated just weeks before the family's departure, caught Jackson's attention. The situation has become too dangerous to continue. Thomas believes we have no choice but to leave, and I fear he is right. But I cannot bear the thought that our work here will be forgotten, or that those who continue the fight for justice will have no resources to draw upon. I have hidden what I can in the sanctuary, along with instructions for those who might one day have need of them. May God bless whoever finds this record and grant them the wisdom to use what we have left behind for good. Papa, there's something else in here, Elijah said. Reaching into the box, he pulled out a small cloth pouch that clinked softly when moved. Inside were several gold coins, more money than Jackson had seen in years. But even more intriguing was the folded paper tucked beneath the coins, a hand-drawn map of the property, with various locations marked and numbered. Jackson studied the map by lantern light, comparing it to his mental picture of the house and grounds. Most of the marked locations corresponded to areas he hadn't yet explored thoroughly: the barn, the well, even a spot in the woods behind the house marked with the notation, "Emergency cache for desperate times." As they prepared to leave the hidden chamber, Jackson noticed something else. Fresh scratches near the keyhole suggested that someone else had been here recently within the last few years. Certainly, the scratches appeared to have been made by someone trying to force the lock, though unsuccessfully. "We need to keep this secret for now," Jackson told Elijah as they climbed back up to the kitchen. "Just between us until we understand what we found." That evening, as Jackson studied Martha's journal by candlelight while Elijah slept, he began to grasp the full scope of what they had inherited. The Henderson family hadn't just operated a safe house. They had created an entire network of resources for those seeking freedom. Money, supplies, even detailed maps showing safe routes through the surrounding territory. But Jackson also understood the danger their discovery represented. If word got out about the hidden treasure, it would attract the wrong kind of attention. Men who cared nothing for the noble cause the Hendersons had served. Men who would see only the monetary value of what lay hidden. As he closed the journal and prepared for sleep, Jackson felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had gambled their last $500 on this house, seeking nothing more than shelter for his son. Instead, he had inherited a legacy that could change their lives, if he was wise enough to protect it and strong enough to prove worthy of it. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the boarded windows and reminding Jackson that winter was not far away. Soon they would need warm clothes, adequate food, and money for taxes. The discovery in the cellar offered hope, but it also brought new challenges he was only beginning to understand. Jackson woke before dawn, his mind churning with questions about their discovery. Martha's journal lay hidden beneath his pillow, and he could feel its presence like a weight against his conscience. The secrets contained in those pages belonged to history now, but they also belonged to him and Elijah, a responsibility he hadn't sought but couldn't abandon. While his son still slept, Jackson crept back down to the hidden chamber. By lamplight, he carefully examined each item on the shelves, trying to piece together the full story of what the Henderson family had left behind. Many of the containers held practical supplies, dried medicines, sewing materials, even children's clothing, in various sizes. These were provisions gathered for desperate people who might arrive with nothing but the clothes on their backs, but other items suggested something more significant. Wrapped in oilcloth, Jackson found official-looking documents, property, deeds, letters of credit, even what appeared to be identity papers with names left blank. The Henderson family had created not just a safe house, but a complete support system for people beginning new lives. Most intriguing was a collection of maps, each more detailed than Martha's simple sketch. These showed not just the immediate area, but routes stretching across several states. Red marks indicated safe houses, blue marks showed potential dangers, and green marks highlighted trusted contacts in various towns. Jackson realized he was looking at part of a vast network that had once helped thousands reach freedom. "Papa?" Elijah's voice called from upstairs. "Where are you?" Jackson quickly secured the chamber and climbed back to the kitchen, where he found his son rubbing sleep from his eyes. The morning routine of breakfast and planning their day provided a welcome return to normalcy, though Jackson's thoughts kept drifting to the secrets beneath their feet. "We need supplies from town," Jackson told Elijah after they'd eaten. "And I want to see about finding work." The walk to Cedar Ridge took 30 minutes, giving Jackson time to think about how to proceed. He needed to learn more about the Henderson family's fate without arousing suspicion. More importantly, he needed to find legitimate work that would provide enough income to pay the property taxes while keeping their discovery secret. Their first stop was Henry Stiles' General Store. The proprietor greeted them warmly, though Jackson noticed Henry's eyes seemed particularly attentive to their conversation. "Settling in well?" Henry asked as he assembled their order: flour, salt, coffee, and other necessities that Jackson could barely afford. "Making progress," Jackson replied carefully. "Found some interesting things left by the previous owners. Old papers, mostly family records." Henry's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "The Hendersons kept detailed records, I recall. Martha was always writing in that journal of hers. Of course, most of that personal stuff probably isn't of much interest to anyone now." "Probably not," Jackson agreed, though he made mental note of Henry's obvious knowledge about Martha's journal. "You wouldn't happen to know of any work available?" "I'm handy with tools, good with animals. Matter of fact, old Johnson needs help with his harvest. Hard work, but he pays fair wages. I could introduce you." While Jackson arranged to meet Johnson the next day, Elijah wandered the store, fascinated by the variety of goods on display. Jackson watched his son examine pocket knives, candy jars, and books with the careful attention of a boy who understood that such luxuries were beyond their reach. April Kepner entered the store as they prepared to leave. She smiled warmly at both Jackson and Elijah, and Jackson felt that familiar flutter of attraction he'd been trying to ignore. "I was hoping I'd see you in town," she said. "I've spoken with the school board about Elijah's education. They're willing to make accommodations for his irregular attendance, given your circumstances." Jackson felt a surge of gratitude. In their travels, finding schooling for Elijah had been a constant challenge. Many schools were reluctant to accept a black child, regardless of his intelligence or eagerness to learn. "That's very generous," Jackson said. "When would he start?" "Next Monday, if that suits you. I'll work with him personally to help him catch up on what he's missed." As they walked home, Elijah peppered Jackson with excited questions about school, new friends, and all the things he hoped to learn. Jackson answered as best he could, though part of his attention remained focused on their mysterious inheritance. That afternoon, while Elijah explored the barn, Jackson returned to Martha's journal. The later entries painted a picture of increasing danger and difficult decisions. Martha wrote about trusted friends who had turned hostile, about midnight visits from federal marshals, and about the growing certainty that their work was no longer. Sustainable.1 entry particularly caught Jackson's attention. Thomas insists we must leave most of our resources behind. The work will continue, he says, and others will have need of what we've gathered. I pray he's right. I've prepared instructions and left them in the place where Sarah's quilt hangs. May God bless whoever inherits this burden. Jackson searched his memory of the hidden chamber. He hadn't noticed any quilt, but perhaps he'd missed something in the dim lamplight. That evening, after Elijah was asleep, he made another careful exploration of the secret room. There, hanging on a wooden peg he'd overlooked before, was a faded quilt. The fabric showed age and wear, but the craftsmanship was still evident, a pattern of interconnected stars in blue and white. When Jackson lifted the quilt carefully from its peg, he found a folded paper tucked behind it. The paper contained detailed instructions in Martha's careful handwriting. She explained the purpose of each cache marked on her maps, provided names and addresses of trusted contacts in distant cities, and outlined procedures for safely helping people begin new lives. At the bottom of the page was a note that made Jackson's breath catch. The emergency funds are substantial enough to help many families or to sustain this operation for years. Use them wisely, but don't hesitate to use them at all. Money serves no purpose if it cannot serve justice. Jackson understood now that the gold coins he'd found were only a small portion of the Henderson family's legacy. Somewhere, according to Martha's maps, additional resources waited for someone with the courage and wisdom to use them properly. But as he studied the documents by lamplight, Jackson heard footsteps on the porch above. Heavy boots moving slowly, deliberately. Someone was prowling around his house in the middle of the night. Jackson extinguished his lamp and moved silently to the cellar stairs. Through gaps in the kitchen floorboards, he could see the shadow of someone peering through windows, testing doors. The intruder moved with familiarity, as if they knew the house's layout. After several tense minutes, the footsteps retreated. Jackson waited another hour before venturing upstairs to check the doors and windows. Everything appeared secure, but the message was clear. Someone else knew about the house's secrets, and they were growing impatient. As Jackson returned to bed, his mind raced with new concerns. The discovery that had seemed like salvation now felt more like a burden. He had inherited not just wealth and resources, but also the dangers that had driven the Henderson family away. Tomorrow he would begin working for Johnson, establishing himself as nothing more than a hard-working farmer trying to provide for his son. But tonight, lying awake in the darkness, Jackson understood that their quiet new life was already under threat from forces he couldn't yet identify. Asterisk. The next morning brought a crisp autumn chill that reminded Jackson winter was approaching faster than he'd hoped. Elijah woke with a slight cough that sent worry through Jackson's chest. Memories of Sarah's illness always lurked just beneath the surface of his consciousness, but the boy's fever was mild, and his spirits remained high as he helped Jackson prepare for the day. "I want to come with you to meet Mr. Johnson," Elijah said, though his voice carried a hoarseness that made Jackson's decision easy. "Not today, son. You need rest, and I need you to stay here and keep an eye on things." Jackson knelt beside Elijah's bed, pressing his palm to the boy's forehead. Warm, but not dangerously so. "Can you do that for me?" Elijah nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of responsibility his father was placing on him. At 8 years old, he'd already learned to be more independent than most children twice his age. Johnson's farm lay 3 miles east of town, a sprawling operation that had clearly prospered over the years. The man himself was exactly what Jackson had expected, weathered, practical, and direct in his manner. He looked Jackson over with the calculating eye of someone accustomed to judging both horseflesh and hired hands. "Henry says you're good with your hands," Johnson said without preamble. "I need someone who can fix fence, handle livestock, and work from dawn to dusk without complaining. Pays $1 a day plus meals. Interested?" $1 a day was fair wages, more than Jackson had hoped for. "Yes, sir. When do I start?" "Right now. Got 20 head of cattle that need moving to the south pasture, and the fence there needs mending before winter." The work was exactly what Jackson needed: physical labor that occupied his hands, while leaving his mind free to process the previous night's discoveries. As he repaired fence posts and guided stubborn cattle, Jackson found himself studying Martha's hand-drawn map from memory, trying to understand the full scope of what he'd inherited. The emergency cache marked in the woods behind his house particularly intrigued him. Martha had written that it contained supplies for desperate times, but she hadn't specified what kind of supplies or how desperate the times might need to be. Given the midnight prowler, Jackson suspected those times might be approaching sooner than he'd hoped. During the lunch break, Johnson's wife brought hot stew and fresh bread to the workers. She was a kind woman who asked about Elijah's health and offered home remedies for childhood ailments. Her maternal concern reminded Jackson painfully of Sarah, but also reinforced his determination to build a stable life for his son. "That boy of yours is lucky to have such a devoted father," she told Jackson as they ate. "Not every child gets that kind of attention, especially these days." Jackson returned home as the sun was setting, exhausted but satisfied with his first day's work. He found Elijah sitting at the kitchen table, carefully copying letters on a slate tablet April had provided. The boy's fever had broken, and his color was much improved. "How was your first day?" Jackson asked, settling into the chair beside his son. "Good, Papa. Miss April came by to check on me. She brought soup and helped me practice my letters." Elijah held up his slate, showing neat rows of alphabet practice. "She said I'm doing real well for someone who hasn't had regular schooling." Jackson felt another wave of gratitude toward April Kepner. Her kindness toward Elijah went beyond the duties of a schoolteacher, and Jackson found himself wondering what her motivations might be. In his experience, people rarely showed such generosity without reason. After supper, while Elijah worked on his letters, Jackson stepped outside to check on their property. The barn needed attention, and he wanted to explore the area where Martha's map indicated the emergency cache. But as he walked toward the woods, he noticed something that made him stop cold. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth near the well prints that definitely didn't belong to him or Elijah. Someone had been on their property again, and recently. Jackson knelt to examine the tracks more closely. The boots were well made, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. Someone with money, someone who took care of their possessions. Following the tracks led Jackson in a rough circle around the house and barn. Whoever had made them was conducting a systematic search of the property, looking for something specific. The trail ended at the edge of the woods, where the ground became too hard to hold clear impressions. That night, after Elijah was asleep, Jackson made his way carefully to the emergency cache location. Martha's map placed it near a distinctive oak tree marked with 3 notches. Jackson found the tree easily enough. The notches were still visible despite 15 years of growth and weather, but someone had been there before him. The ground around the tree's base showed signs of recent digging, though the excavation had been carefully filled in and disguised. Jackson began digging in the same spot, working quietly by moonlight. 10 feet down, his shovel struck something solid, not wood or metal, but stone, a flat slab that covered what appeared to be another underground chamber. Jackson managed to shift the stone enough to peer inside with his lantern. This cache was different from the hidden room in the cellar. Where that space had been designed for hiding people, this one was clearly meant for storing valuable items. Long-term, wooden crates lined the walls, each one carefully sealed against moisture and marked with cryptic symbols. But several of the crates had been opened and searched, their contents scattered across the dirt floor. Jackson climbed down into the cache for a closer look. Gold coins glittered among the debris, along with silver jewelry, bundled currency, and what appeared to be stock certificates from various companies. Someone had been here recently, searching for something specific among the Henderson family's emergency resources, but they hadn't found everything. In one corner, hidden behind a false wall that Jackson might have missed if not for Martha's detailed instructions, he found an intact crate. Inside were documents that made his hands tremble: property deeds to valuable land in California, letters of credit from banks in San Francisco and Denver, and most shocking of all, stock certificates for mining operations that had struck major silver veins in Colorado. Jackson realized he was looking at a fortune that dwarfed anything he'd imagined. The Henderson family hadn't just operated a station on the Underground Railroad. They had built a financial network that could have supported hundreds of people seeking new lives. This wasn't just money hidden for emergencies. This was generational wealth. But as he carefully resealed the hidden crate and prepared to leave the cache, Jackson heard voices approaching through the woods. Two men, speaking in hushed tones about searches and time running out. Jackson extinguished his lantern and pressed himself against the earthen wall of the underground chamber. "Told you the old man was getting impatient," one voice said. 15 years he's been waiting for someone to buy that cursed house and find what's hidden there. "Well, now someone has," replied the second voice. "Question is whether this Jackson fellow has found anything yet, or if he's just another poor fool trying to scratch out a living." Jackson's blood ran cold as he realized these men were talking about him. Worse, they seemed to be working for someone who had been waiting specifically for the house to be purchased. The voices moved past his hiding place, continuing their patrol of the woods. Jackson waited until he could no longer hear them before climbing out of the cache and carefully replacing the stone cover. His mind raced as he made his way back to the house, staying in shadows and moving as quietly as possible. Someone had been orchestrating events from the beginning. The house hadn't been abandoned and forgotten. It had been watched, waited for. And now that Jackson had bought it, forces were moving that he didn't understand. As he slipped back into the house and checked on his sleeping son, Jackson made a decision. Tomorrow, he would confide in April Kepner. Her knowledge of local history and her obvious care for Elijah's welfare suggested she could be trusted. More importantly, he was going to need allies if he hoped to protect both his son and the Henderson family's legacy. The weight of Martha's wedding ring pressed against his chest as Jackson finally settled into bed. He had gambled their last $500 on what he thought was simply shelter. Instead, he'd inherited a treasure that men had died for, secrets that powerful people wanted to keep buried, and a responsibility that stretched far beyond his own family's needs. Outside, the wind carried the sound of distant voices, and Jackson knew that their quiet new life was about to become much more complicated. Jackson arrived at April's boarding house the next evening with his heart pounding and Elijah's hand firmly in his own. The decision to trust her hadn't come easily, but the voices in the woods had made one thing clear: he couldn't protect his son alone. April answered the door wearing a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back in a loose bun that made her look younger than her 30 years. "Jackson, Elijah, what a pleasant surprise. Come in, please." Her boarding house room was small but comfortable, with books lining the walls and papers scattered across a writing desk. The scent of lavender and ink filled the air, creating an atmosphere of safety that Jackson desperately needed. "Miss Kepner," Jackson began, then stopped, unsure how to proceed. How did a man explain that he'd inherited a fortune built on secrets that men were willing to kill for? "April," she corrected gently, "and you look troubled. What's wrong?" Jackson pulled Martha Henderson's journal from his coat and placed it on her desk. April's eyes widened as she recognized the leather binding and initials embossed on the cover. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, handling the journal with reverence. "Hidden in my house, along with other things. Things that suggest than anyone realized." April opened the journal carefully, reading Martha's words with growing amazement. As Jackson explained about the hidden chamber, the maps, and the cache in the woods, April's expression shifted from surprise to concern to something approaching fear. "Jackson, do you understand what you found? This isn't just historical artifacts. This is documentation of one of the most successful underground railroad operations in the territory. Martha Henderson helped more than 300 people reach freedom, but she also made enemies. Powerful enemies who lost considerable money when their human property disappeared. Someone's been watching the house," Jackson admitted, "waiting for someone to buy it and find what was hidden there." April set the journal down with trembling hands. There are men in this territory who never forgot what Martha Henderson cost them. Men with long memories and longer reach. If they know you found her records. "Papa, what's wrong?" Elijah asked from his chair near the window. He'd been quietly looking at April's books, but the tension in the adult conversation had captured his attention. Jackson knelt beside his son, choosing his words carefully. "There are people who might want to take away the things we found in our house. Things that belong to the family who lived there before us." Elijah's young face grew serious. "Bad people? Maybe. That's why we need Miss April's help." April moved to her desk and pulled out a folder filled with newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. "I've been researching the Henderson family for years. It's been a personal interest of mine their story deserves to be remembered and honored. But I never imagined their records still existed." She spread the papers across her desk, showing Jackson articles about mysterious disappearances of slaves from various plantations. Reports of federal marshals investigating Underground Railroad activities, and most chilling of all, accounts of violence against suspected conductors after the war ended. "This man," April pointed to a newspaper photograph of a well-dressed gentleman with cold eyes, "is Vincent Blackwood. He owned 3 plantations before the war and lost everything when his slaves disappeared. The article estimates Martha Henderson cost him over $50,000 in human property." Jackson studied the photograph, memorizing the face of a man who might still pose a threat to his family. "There's more," April continued. "Blackwood never accepted the end of slavery. After the war, he became involved in various schemes to reclaim his wealth, some legal, many not. He spent the last 20 years tracking down former conductors and demanding compensation for his losses. Is he still alive? As far as I know. He'd be in his 70s now, but men like that don't give up easily. And they pass their hatred down to their children." Jackson felt the walls closing in around him. What had seemed like a miraculous discovery now felt like a curse that threatened everything he'd hoped to build for Elijah. "There's something else you need to know," April said quietly. "I think Henry Stiles may be involved in this somehow. He's asked me too many questions about my research into the Henderson family. Questions that suggest he knows more than he's letting on." The revelation hit Jackson like a physical blow. Henry had been friendly, helpful, even generous with supplies. But now Jackson remembered the man's intense interest in their house, his probing questions about what they'd found. "What do we do?" Jackson asked. April was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents spread across her desk. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a determination that reminded Jackson why he'd been drawn to her. "We protect Martha's legacy, and we protect your family. But first, we need to understand exactly what resources you've inherited. If Vincent Blackwood is indeed behind the surveillance of your property, He's not just looking for revenge. He's looking for money. Martha Henderson had access to considerable funds during her years of operation. You may believe some of that wealth is still hidden. Jackson made a decision that would change the course of their lives. I need to show you something. Both of you need to see what we're really dealing with. That night, by lamplight, Jackson led April and Elijah down to the hidden chamber beneath their kitchen. April gasped when she saw the carved names on the walls, the evidence of so many lives touched by Martha Henderson's courage. But when Jackson showed her the documents and maps he'd discovered, she grew pale. Jackson, this is more than an underground railroad station. This is documentation of our entire network that stretched across 5 states. These maps, these contact lists, they're worth a fortune to historians, but they're also dangerous. Some of the people named here may still be alive, and their involvement was never made public. Jackson pulled out the small iron box he'd found, revealing the Confederate coins and the cryptic note about understanding sacrifice. April examined the coins by lamplight, her expression growing troubled. These aren't just any Confederate coins, she said slowly. Look at the dates. They're all from before major battles, before the currency became worthless. Someone was converting Confederate money into gold and silver, probably to fund underground railroad operations. This represents a substantial sum, even today. As they prepared to leave the chamber, April noticed something. Jackson had missaid fresh scratches around the stone keyhole, evidence that someone else had been trying to gain access to the hidden room. Jackson, you can't stay in this house, she said urgently. Not with Elijah. If someone else knows about these secrets, this is our home, Jackson replied firmly. I won't run from shadows and threats, but I need your help to understand what we're facing and how to protect ourselves. April studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the determination that had carried him through widowerhood and hardship to this moment of crisis. Slowly, she nodded. Then we do this together. But we do it carefully, and we do it smart. Martha Henderson was brave, but she was also clever. If we're going to honor her legacy and protect your family, we'll need to be both. As they climbed back to the kitchen, Jackson felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. He had all eyes now, but he also had a clearer understanding of the forces arrayed against them. The game that had begun with his desperate purchase of an abandoned farmhouse was becoming something much more complex and dangerous. The next few days brought an uneasy normalcy to Jackson's routine. He worked Johnson's farm during daylight hours, his hands busy with harvest tasks while his mind wrestled with the implications of their discoveries. Ella just started school, coming home each afternoon with stories of new friends and lessons learned. April visited regularly, always with legitimate reasons, checking on Elijah's progress, bringing educational materials, offering advice about winter preparations. But beneath the surface of ordinary life, Jackson sensed watching eyes and growing tension. Henry Stiles appeared at their door twice during the week, ostensibly to check on their settling in, but his questions probed deeper each time. Where exactly had they found the old papers? Had Jackson discovered anything of historical value? Did he plan to make any major changes to the property? Jackson answered carefully, revealing nothing while trying to gauge Henry's true motivations. The store owner's friendly demeanor never slipped, but his eyes held an intensity that made Jackson increasingly wary. It was April who made the breakthrough that changed everything. She arrived at their house on Friday evening, carrying a carpet bag and wearing the expression of someone who had made a difficult decision. I've been doing more research, she announced without preamble, about Vincent Blackwood, about the Henderson family, and about certain other people in this community. We need to talk. Jackson sent Elijah to his room with a book and instructions to practice his reading while the adults discussed grown-up matters. Once they were alone, April pulled a collection of documents from her bag. I found these in the Territorial Records Office, she said, spreading papers across the kitchen table. Property transfers, business partnerships, even some correspondence that was filed with legal documents. Jackson, I think I know why someone's been watching this house, and it's not just about revenge. She pointed to a property deed dated 1869. This shows that Vincent Blackwood had a financial stake in several properties in this area, including mineral rights to land adjacent to your house. But look at this. The next document was a survey map showing precise property boundaries. Jackson's land was marked clearly, but so were several neighboring plots, all connected by a web of easements and shared mineral rights. According to these documents, there may be significant silver deposits beneath your property and the surrounding area. Blackwood invested heavily in mining operations here, but the war disrupted his plans. He's been waiting for someone to develop this land so he could claim his mineral rights. Jackson felt his stomach drop. You're saying the house was just bait? I'm saying Vincent Blackwood has been playing a very long game. He couldn't develop the land himself. Too much scrutiny. Too many questions about his wartime activities. But if someone else bought the property and began finding valuable things hidden there, it would provide cover for his own excavations. April pulled out another document, this one bearing Henry Stiles' signature. Henry has been Blackwood's agent here for at least 10 years. He's been reporting on everyone who showed interest in the Henderson property, waiting for the right moment. The betrayal hit Jackson harder than he'd expected. Henry's kindness, his offers of help, even his provision of supplies, all calculated moves in a larger scheme. But April wasn't finished with her revelations. There's more. I found Martha Henderson's dress among some donated clothing at the church. The pastor said Henry Stiles brought it in years ago, claiming he found it among items left behind when the family departed. But Jackson, there are documents sewn into the lining. April carefully extracted a folded paper from the dress's inner seam. The document was in Martha's handwriting, but it wasn't part of her journal. This was a set of architectural drawings showing the true layout of the underground chambers beneath the house. Martha designed more than just a hiding place, April explained as they studied the drawings. She created an entire underground complex with multiple chambers, storage areas, and escape routes. Some of these spaces you haven't discovered yet. The drawings revealed at least 3 additional chambers connected to the main hidden room. One appeared to be directly beneath the barn, another under the well, and a third that extended toward the woods where Jackson had found the emergency cache. Why would she need such an elaborate system? Jackson asked. Because she wasn't just hiding runaway slaves, April replied. According to these notes, Martha was also safeguarding stolen Confederate gold, documents that could incriminate prominent citizens, and evidence of war crimes committed by men like Blackwood. She was protecting information that could destroy reputations and end political careers. Jackson studied the architectural drawings with growing amazement. Martha Henderson hadn't just been a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She'd been operating a sophisticated intelligence network that threatened some of the most powerful men in the territory. That's why they couldn't simply arrest her during the war, April continued. She had too much information, too many secrets that important people wanted to keep buried. So they waited, applying pressure gradually until she had no choice but to flee. But she left everything behind for someone else to find, Jackson realized. Someone she trusted to use it wisely. Jackson, I think Martha Henderson knew exactly what kind of man would eventually buy this house. A man with a family to protect. Someone who understood sacrifice. Someone who would honor the legacy she was leaving behind. As they talked, Elijah appeared in the doorway, holding his reading book, but clearly having overheard parts of their conversation. "Papa, are we in danger?" he asked with the direct honesty that children possess. Jackson knelt beside his son, choosing his words carefully. Some people want to take things that don't belong to them. But we're going to make sure that doesn't happen. Like the bad men who tried to catch the people Mama Martha helped." Jackson smiled despite the gravity of their situation. In Elijah's young mind, Martha Henderson had become a heroic figure, someone who fought against injustice and protected families like their own. "That's right, son. Like those men." April watched this exchange with obvious emotion. When Elijah returned to his room, she spoke quietly but with fierce determination. "We can't let Henry and Blackwood win this. Martha Henderson died believing that good people would continue her work. Your son sees this as a fight between good and evil, and he's not wrong." Jackson felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders once again. They had uncovered secrets that powerful men would kill to protect, treasures that could secure his family's future, and evidence of historical injustices that deserved to be exposed. But they also faced enemies with resources, influence, and decades of patience. "What do you propose we do?" Jackson asked. April spread Martha's architectural drawings across the table once more. "We explore the remaining chambers. We document everything we find. And we prepare for the confrontation that's coming, whether we want it or not." That night, as Jackson lay in bed listening to the familiar creaks and settling sounds of the old house, he understood that their quiet new life was ending. Forces had been set in motion long before his desperate gamble at the property auction, and now those forces were converging on his family. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Jackson felt he wasn't facing the future alone. April had chosen to stand with them, and together they would either protect Martha Henderson's legacy or die trying. Outside, the wind carried new sounds, footsteps, whispered voices, and the soft nickering of horses hidden in the darkness. The watchers were drawing closer, and time was running out. Jackson woke to the sound of horses approaching the house. Dawn was still an hour away, but the rhythmic hoofbeats and jangle of harness told him this wasn't a casual visit. He slipped from bed, checking that Elijah still slept peacefully, and moved to the window. 5 riders sat their horses in his front yard, dark silhouettes against the pre-dawn sky. Even in the dim light, Jackson recognized Henry Styles' lean figure and the distinctive broad-shouldered shape of Vincent Blackwood from April's newspaper photograph. The other 3 men were strangers, but their posture and the way they held their reins suggested hired muscle rather than local farmers. Jackson Avery. Blackwood's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We need to talk. Come out and bring whatever you found that belongs to me." Jackson's hand went instinctively to Sarah's ring hanging beneath his shirt. These men represented everything he'd hoped to escape by coming west: the entitled cruelty of those who saw other humans as property, the casual violence of power unchecked by conscience. "Papa?" Elijah's sleepy voice came from behind him. "Who's outside?" "Stay in your room, son," Jackson said quietly. "No matter what you hear, don't come out until I call for you." Jackson dressed quickly and checked the rifle he kept loaded beside his bed. 5 against 1 were poor odds, but he wouldn't surrender without a fight. As he moved toward the front door, he heard another sound that made his blood freeze. Woman's voice, sharp with fear and anger. "Let me go. I told you. I don't know where it is." April. They had April. Jackson opened the front door to find Henry Styles holding a gun on April while Blackwood sat his horse like some feudal lord surveying his domain. The older man was exactly as Jackson had imagined from the newspaper photograph, silver-haired, expensively dressed, and radiating the cold confidence of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. "Mr. Avery," Blackwood said conversationally, "I apologize for the early hour, but time has become a factor in our business arrangement." "We don't have any business," Jackson replied, though he kept his rifle pointed toward the ground. With April in their hands, he couldn't risk open confrontation. "Oh, but we do. You see, you've been living on my property, finding my treasure." and keeping what belongs to me. That creates a debt that needs settling." Henry stepped forward, his familiar face now showing the predatory gleam Jackson had missed before. "Jackson, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We know you found Martha Henderson's records. We know about the gold, the documents, probably even the mineral rights surveys. Just tell us where everything is hidden and nobody gets hurt." "Especially the boy," Blackwood added casually, though his words carried unmistakable menace. "Children can be so fragile, and accidents happen so easily on frontier farms." Jackson felt rage building in his chest, the same protective fury that had sustained him through Sarah's illness and their subsequent hardships. But April caught his eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. She was telling him to be patient, to wait for the right moment. "What exactly do you think I found?" Jackson asked, playing for time while studying the positioning of Blackwood's men. "Don't play games," Blackwood snapped. "Martha Henderson stole from me for years. Slaves worth thousands of dollars, information that cost me political influence, and gold that should have funded my mining operations. She hid it all somewhere on this property, and you're going to help me recover it. And if I refuse—" Henry pulled back the hammer on his pistol, a metallic click loud in the morning air. "Then Miss Kepner pays the price for your stubbornness. And after that, we'll search every inch of this property anyway. Your son might even help us, once he understands the consequences of refusing." Jackson's finger tightened on his rifle trigger, but before he could act, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "Nobody's going to hurt that boy." Carter Smith emerged from the shadows near the barn, carrying a shotgun and wearing a deputy's badge that glinted in the early light. Behind him came two more men Jackson didn't recognize, both armed and moving with the purposeful coordination of experienced lawmen. Blackwood's confident expression flickered for the first time. "Carter, what are you doing here?" "This doesn't concern the territorial government." "Actually, it does," Carter replied, though he kept his weapon trained on Henry rather than Blackwood. "You see, Vincent, I've been investigating your activities for the U.S. Marshal's Office for the past 2 years. All those mining claims, all those property transfers, they were bought with stolen Confederate gold. Gold that Martha Henderson documented very carefully before you drove her out of the territory." Henry's gun wavered as he realized the trap closing around them. "Carter, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Carter interrupted. "You've been Vincent Blackwood's agent here, watching this property, waiting for someone to find Martha's records so you could claim them. But what you didn't know is that April Kepner has been working with me, gathering evidence of your conspiracy." April stepped away from Henry as the deputy's gun no longer threatened her. "Martha Henderson wasn't just documenting Underground Railroad activities, Vincent. She was building a case against you and men like you. War profiteers who sold supplies to both sides, who stole from the government, who committed treason for profit." Blackwood's mask of genteel authority finally slipped, revealing the desperate criminal beneath. "You can't prove any of that. Those records are 20 years old, but the mineral rights fraud is current," Carter said. "Those claims you've been filing are based on forged surveys and stolen documentation. Jackson Avery owns this land legally, and everything found on it belongs to him." Jackson looked around at the unfolding drama, understanding finally dawning. This was all planned. "April, you've been working with the law this whole time." "Not the whole time," April replied, her eyes meeting his. "But when I realized what you'd found, I knew we needed federal help. Martha Henderson wasn't just fighting slavery, she was fighting corruption that reached into the territorial government itself." Henry made a desperate move, swinging his gun toward Elijah's bedroom window. "The boy." Jackson's rifle spoke before Henry could finish the threat. The store owner crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder and screaming curses. Blackwood's hired men found themselves staring down the barrels of federal weapons, and the fight went out of them as quickly as it had begun. As Carter and his men secured the prisoners, Jackson felt Elijah's small hand slip into his. His son had disobeyed orders and emerged from the house, but Jackson was too relieved to be angry.
"Papa, are the bad men going away now?" Elijah asked.
"Yes, son, they're going away." But even as federal marshals loaded Vincent Blackwood and his accomplices into a prison wagon, Jackson knew the danger wasn't entirely past. Men like Blackwood had long reach and patient plans. There would be others who knew about Martha Henderson's legacy, others who would come looking for what they believed was rightfully theirs. April approached as the law officers prepared to depart with their prisoners. "Jackson, there's something else you need to know. The federal government wants to purchase Martha's documents for the National Archives. They're offering enough money to secure your family's future and turn this property into a historical site." Jackson looked at his house, their house, imagining it preserved as a monument to Martha Henderson's courage and the people she had helped. It wasn't the quiet life he'd hoped for when he gambled their last $500 on an abandoned farmhouse, but it was something better, a legacy that would honor the past while building a future for his son. "What about you?" Jackson asked April. "What happens now?" April smiled, the expression transforming her face from serious schoolteacher to something warmer, more personal. "I've been offered a position documenting Underground Railroad sites for the Territorial Historical Society. The work would be based here, in Cedar Ridge." Jackson felt his heart speed up as the implications of her words sank in. "Here? If that would be acceptable to you, and to Elijah." Before Jackson could answer, his son tugged on his sleeve. "Papa, does that mean Miss April will stay and help us take care of Mama Martha's house?" Jackson knelt beside Elijah, understanding that his son had grasped something the adults were still dancing around. "Would you like that, son?" "Yes, Papa. I think Mama Sarah would like it too." As the sun finally rose over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jackson Avery realized that their desperate gamble had led to something he'd never dared hope for. Not just a home, but a family, a purpose, and a future built on the foundation of courage that Martha Henderson had left for them to find. The arrest of Vincent Blackwood and his conspirators should have marked the end of their troubles. But Jackson's instincts, honed by years of surviving on society's margins, told him otherwise. Men like Blackwood didn't operate in isolation. They built networks of eyes, debtors and fellow criminals who had their own reasons for keeping dangerous secrets buried. Carter Smith confirmed Jackson's suspicions when he returned 3 days after the arrests, his expression grim with new intelligence. Blackwood made bail, Carter announced without preamble as he settled into a chair at Jackson's kitchen table. "Federal judge in the territorial capital. Seems Blackwood has friends in high places who vouched for his character." April sat down, her coffee cup with enough force to rattle the saucer. "How is that possible?" "We have documented evidence of his crimes. Evidence that still needs to be authenticated and verified in court." Carter interrupted. "Martha Henderson's records are 20 years old, and good lawyers can raise questions about their accuracy. Meanwhile, Blackwood's walking free and hiring the best legal counsel money can buy." Jackson felt the familiar weight of Sarah's ring against his chest as he processed this new threat. "What does this mean for us?" "It means you're still in danger. Blackwood's legal troubles won't be resolved quickly, and he's got nothing to lose by trying to recover what he believes is his property. Plus, there are other people who have interests in keeping Martha Henderson's discoveries quiet." Carter pulled out a folder thick with official documents. "I've been investigating the broader network that Blackwood was part of. There are at least 6 other men in positions of territorial authority who have reasons to want Martha's records destroyed. Judges, legislators, even a territorial representative who's been pushing for statehood." "What kind of reasons?" April asked. the kind that end careers and start federal investigations. Martha didn't just document Underground Railroad activities. She recorded evidence of war profiteering, election fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the federal government of mineral rights. Some very important people are mentioned in those journals. Jackson studied the list of names Carter provided. Many were unfamiliar, but several belonged to men whose businesses he'd encountered during his travels across the territory. Store owners who had charged exorbitant prices to desperate families, land agents who had sold the same property to multiple buyers, even a territorial judge who had been particularly harsh in his treatment of freed slaves seeking legal recognition of their status. "So what do?" Jackson asked. "We prepare for the worst while hoping for the best," Carter replied. "The federal government wants those documents, and they're willing to provide protection for you and your family until the legal proceedings are concluded. But that protection comes with conditions." Carter spread out a map of the surrounding area, marking various locations with colored pins. "You'll need to move temporarily to a safe house in the territorial capital. Federal marshals will maintain security around this property while we excavate and catalog everything in Martha's hidden chambers. The process could take months." Jackson felt his stomach tighten. Leaving their home now, just when they'd begun to build a real life, seemed like abandoning everything they'd worked for. But one look at Elijah, who was quietly practicing his letters at the far end of the table, reminded Jackson what truly mattered. "There's another option," April said quietly. "One that might be more dangerous but would let you stay here." Both men looked at her expectantly. "We turn this into a trap. Let word get out that Jackson found something significant in the emergency cache, something that threatens more than just Blackwood's interests. When they come for it, we'll be ready." Carter shook his head immediately. "Too risky. We don't know how many people we're dealing with or what resources they have access to. Jackson's not a trained lawman, but he's a man fighting for his family," April interrupted. "And he knows this property better than anyone now. Plus, Martha Henderson designed these underground chambers as defensive positions. She was expecting trouble when she built them." Jackson found himself studying Martha's architectural drawings once again, seeing them now not just as hiding places, but as the fortifications April described. The interconnected chambers, the multiple escape routes, the strategic placement. Mere natural defensive features. Martha had been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. "What would we need to do?" Jackson asked. April moved to the drawings, pointing out specific features. "First, we explore the remaining chambers that we haven't accessed yet. Martha's notes suggest there are weapons and supplies stored in some of them, provisions for extended siege if necessary. Second," Carter added reluctantly, "we coordinate with federal authorities to position backup support in the area. If we're going to use you as bait, we need to ensure you're not facing this alone. And third," April continued, "we document everything we find before any confrontation occurs. If something happens to us, the historical record needs to survive." Over the next week, they implemented their desperate plan with methodical care. Jackson continued working Johnson's farm during the day, maintaining the appearance of normal routine while secretly mapping the underground complex beneath their property. April divided her time between the schoolhouse and research trips to the territorial capital, ostensibly gathering materials for her historical documentation project. The remaining chambers proved to contain treasures beyond anything Jackson had imagined. In the space beneath the barn, they found not just gold and silver coins, but also a complete printing press and supplies for creating identity documents. Martha Henderson hadn't just helped people escape slavery. She had equipped them with new identities and the means to build new lives. The chamber beneath the well contained something even more valuable. A library of books and documents that represented the intellectual wealth of the Underground Railroad network. Legal texts, medical treatises, educational materials, and personal accounts of the journey from slavery to freedom. This was the knowledge base that had sustained the movement, preserved now for future generations. But it was the third chamber, extending toward the woods, that provided the military supplies April had hoped to find. Martha Henderson had been preparing for war. Rifles, ammunition, explosives for demolishing cave-ins or blocking pursuit routes, and most importantly, detailed maps showing defensive positions throughout the surrounding area. She was ready to make a stand. April observed as they catalogued the weapons by lamplight. If the authorities had tried to shut down her operation by force, she could have held them off indefinitely. Jackson hefted one of the rifles, checking its condition. The weapon was well maintained despite its age, ready for immediate use. Maybe that's what we need to do. Make our own stand. Carter arrived that evening with news that confirmed their worst fears and best hopes simultaneously. Blackwoods, gathering supporters. My contacts in the territorial capital report, at least 12 men have been seen meeting with him regularly, including some faces we recognize from wanted posters. He's not just planning to recover what he thinks you found. He's organizing a small army. How long do we have? Jackson asked. Days, not weeks. There's been increased activity around town. Strangers asking questions about your property and your routine. They're conducting surveillance, gathering intelligence for an assault. But Carter also brought encouraging news. Federal marshals have been positioned at strategic points around the area. Not close enough to interfere with normal activities, but ready to respond when needed. And there's been a development in the legal case that might change everything. Carter pulled out a telegram from his coat. Turns out Vincent Blackwood made a crucial mistake 20 years ago. When he filed his mineral rights claims, he used forged surveys based on Martha Henderson's genuine surveys. But Martha kept the originals, and they proved that his claims overlap with federal land grants that were never legally transferred. What does that mean? April asked. It means Blackwood's mining operations have been illegal from the beginning. He's been stealing from the federal government for 2 decades, and Martha's original surveys prove it. When this evidence is presented in court, he's looking at federal prison, not just fines and restitution. Jackson understood the implications immediately. So he's got nothing left to lose. If he's going to prison anyway, he might as well try to recover whatever he can from Martha's caches. Exactly. Which makes him more dangerous than ever. Desperate. Men make desperate choices. That night, after Carter departed and Elijah was safely asleep, Jackson and April made their final preparations. They moved the most valuable documents and artifacts to secure hiding places, loaded weapons and positioned them at strategic points throughout the underground complex, and established signals for communicating with the federal marshals positioned around the property. Jackson, April said as they completed their preparations, "There's something I need to tell you. Something personal." Jackson looked up from the rifle he'd been cleaning, seeing something vulnerable in April's expression that she'd kept hidden. "Until now, I didn't come to Cedar Ridge by accident. My brother was one of the people Martha Henderson helped escape slavery. He made it to California, built a successful life, raised a family. When he died 5 years ago, he left me a letter explaining how Martha Henderson had saved him, given him identity papers and enough money to start over." Jackson felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "That's why you've been so committed to preserving her story. That's why I was already researching the Henderson family when you arrived in town. I came here hoping to find some trace of what happened to her, some way to honor what she'd done for my family. When you discovered her records, it felt like divine providence." Jackson reached across the table and took April's hand. "Your brother would be proud of what you're doing. I hope so. But Jackson, I need you to understand if something happens. Tomorrow, if we don't both survive this, I want you to know that these past weeks have meant more to me than just historical research. You and Elijah have become family, Jackson finished softly. I know. I feel it too. They held hands across Martha Henderson's architectural drawings. Two people who had found each other in the midst of danger and uncertainty, united by respect for a woman they'd never met, but whose courage had shaped both their lives. Outside, the wind carried new sounds, the distant whicker of horses, the soft murmur of men's voices planning violence in the darkness. Jackson checked his pocket watch. 3 hours until dawn. 3 hours until Vincent Blackwood and his allies would discover that some fights are worth having, regardless of the odds. Jackson squeezed April's hand once more, then rose to check on his sleeping son. Elijah lay peaceful in his bed, one arm wrapped around the wooden horse Jackson had carved for him, the other clutching the picture book Sarah had read to him so many times the binding was worn soft. I won't let them hurt you, son, Jackson whispered into the darkness. Whatever it costs, whatever I have to do, you're going to grow up free and safe. As Jackson returned to the kitchen to make final preparations, he touched Sarah's ring one last time. Tomorrow would test everything he'd learned about courage, sacrifice, and the price of protecting what mattered most. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of Martha Henderson's courage and April's loyalty, Jackson Avery felt ready for whatever dawn might bring. The battle for their home, their family, and Martha Henderson's legacy was about to begin. Asterisk, the attack came with the first gray light of dawn, just as Jackson had expected. He was already awake, positioned at the kitchen window with Martha's rifle, when the first riders appeared at the edge of the woods. Vincent Blackwood had brought more men than Carter's intelligence had suggested. Jackson counted at least 15 mounted figures spreading out to surround the house. April, Jackson called softly. She appeared immediately from the bedroom where she'd been watching Elijah sleep, her own rifle ready and her face set with grim determination. How many? She asked. Too many for a fair fight. But Martha didn't build this place for fair fights. They had rehearsed their defensive plan carefully. At the first sign of attack, they would retreat to the hidden chamber system, using the interconnected passages to move freely beneath the property, while their attackers were forced to search room by room above ground. The underground complex gave them multiple advantages, protected positions, cache supplies, and escape routes that their enemies couldn't predict. Blackwood's voice boomed across the morning air, carrying the arrogant authority of a man accustomed to intimidating others into submission. Jackson Avery, you've got something that belongs to me, and I've come to collect it. Send the woman and boy out unharmed, and we can settle this between men. Jackson moved to the front window, staying in shadows but making sure his voice could be heard. The only thing here that belonged to you was the evil you brought with you, Blackwood, and that's about to be buried permanent. You're outnumbered 15-1, you fool. I've got men surrounding this property, and federal marshals won't reach you in time to make a difference. Surrender now, and I promise the boy won't be harmed. Jackson's response was to fire a single shot through the front window, the bullet splintering wood inches from Blackwood's horse. The animal reared and danced, nearly unseating its rider, while the other attackers scattered for cover. That's my answer, Jackson called. You want what's in this house? You'll have to come and take it. Blackwood's fury was audible in his shouted commands to his men. Burn them out. We'll find what we need in the ashes. The assault began immediately. Men with torches rushed the house from 3 directions, while others provided covering fire. Jackson and April had anticipated this tactic. Frontier buildings were notoriously vulnerable to fire attacks. But Martha Henderson had planned for this contingency too. Now, Jackson told April, and they triggered the mechanism she had discovered in Martha's architectural notes. Hidden pipes throughout the house's walls released stored water in a controlled flood that doused the interior surfaces and made ignition nearly impossible. The attackers' torches hissed and died as they struck the dampened wood. Buying precious time for the defenders' next move, Jackson scooped the still sleeping Elijah from his bed, wrapping the boy in blankets while April gathered the most critical documents from Martha's collection. They had less than 2 minutes before Blackwood's men would breach the house and discover their escape route. The hidden entrance in the kitchen floor opened smoothly despite its age, revealing the ladder that led to Martha's underground sanctuary. Jackson descended first, carrying Elijah, while April followed with their supplies and secured the entrance behind them. Above their heads, the sounds of splintering wood and shouted curses indicated that Blackwood's men had entered the house. But they would find nothing except empty rooms and the evidence of a well-planned retreat. "Papa, what's happening?" Elijah asked, finally awakening fully as Jackson carried him through the narrow underground passage. "Bad men are trying to take our house, son, but we're going to stop them." The main chamber provided their first defensive position. Jackson positioned April at the concealed entrance, a rifle trained on the approach route, while he moved Elijah to the safest corner and armed himself with 2 of Martha's weapons. The sounds above grew more frantic as Blackwood's men realized their quarry had vanished. Heavy boots tramped through every room, followed by the crash of furniture being overturned and walls being tested for hidden passages. "They'll find the entrance eventually," April whispered. "That's what we're counting on," Jackson replied. Martha Henderson had designed the chamber system as more than just hiding places. They were killing grounds. The narrow passages forced attackers to approach in single file, negating their numerical advantage. The main chamber had multiple firing positions with overlapping fields of fire, while the defenders could retreat through escape routes that their enemies couldn't predict or follow. Above them, a triumphant shout indicated someone had discovered the hidden entrance. Jackson heard boots on the ladder, then cautious movement in the passage leading to their position. "Remember," Jackson told April quietly, "we don't have to defeat them all. We just have to hold them until help arrives." The first attacker appeared at the chamber entrance, silhouetted against the dim light from the passage behind him. Jackson's rifle spoke once, and the man crumpled. The narrow passage made it impossible for his companions to drag him clear or advance past his body. "That's one," Jackson said grimly, reloading with practiced efficiency. 14 to go. Asterisk. The battle for the underground chamber raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Blackwood's men discovered quickly that their numerical advantage meant nothing in the confined spaces Martha Henderson had designed. Each approach route became a death trap, each passage a bottleneck that favored the defenders. Jackson moved between firing positions with the fluid efficiency of a man fighting for his family's life. April proved herself equally capable, her shots precise and deadly as attackers tried to flank their position through alternate passages. But it was Elijah who made the discovery that changed everything. "Papa, there's writing on the wall here," the boy called from the corner where Jackson had positioned him for safety. Jackson glanced back during a lull in the fighting to see Elijah tracing letters carved into the stone wall. The writing was in Martha Henderson's careful script, and it took Jackson a moment to make sense of the message in the dim lamplight. "If you are reading this, the sanctuary has been breached, and you are fighting for your life. The final defense is beneath your feet. Pull the ring hidden in the floor to flood the passages and escape through the well chamber." Jackson looked down and found, almost invisible in the packed earth, an iron ring set flush with the ground. He understood immediately Martha had designed a way to flood the entire underground complex, presumably using water from the well chamber to make the passages impassable. But activating the flood would trap them in the main chamber with no escape route except the well shaft itself, a climb that would be treacherous even under ideal conditions. "April," Jackson called softly, "we need to talk." He quickly explained what Elijah had discovered while keeping his rifle trained on the passage entrance. April's face went pale as she grasped the implications. If we flood the passages, we'll be trapped here until we can climb out through the well. And if Blackwood's men are waiting above, we'll deal with that when we get there, Jackson interrupted. Right now, we're running low on ammunition, and they're going to overwhelm us eventually. This might be our only chance. Before April could respond, a new voice echoed through the passages, Vincent Blackwood himself, finally descending to take personal control of the assault. Enough of this foolishness. Blackwood's cultured tones carried easily in the confined space. I know you can hear me, Avery. You're trapped down there like a rat in a hole, and my patience is exhausted. Send the woman and boy out, and I'll make your death quick. Jackson's response was another rifle shot that ricocheted off stone walls and sent Blackwood's men scrambling for cover. I'll take that as a refusal, Blackwood called. Very well. Man, we'll smoke them out. The acrid smell of burning cloth and oil soon filled the chamber as Blackwood's men lit torches and began filling the passages with smoke. The underground complex that had been their sanctuary was becoming a death trap. Now, Papa? Elijah asked, his young face serious with understanding of their desperate situation. Jackson looked at his son, then at April, seeing in both faces the trust that they placed in his judgment. Martha Henderson had designed this final defense for exactly this moment, when all other options were exhausted and only the most desperate measure remained. Now, Jackson agreed and pulled the iron ring. The response was immediate and dramatic. Water poured through hidden channels in the walls, flooding the passages with surprising speed and force. The sounds of Blackwood's men turned from confident advance to panicked retreat as the underground complex became a maze of rushing water and blocked escape routes. But the flooding also sealed their own fate. The chamber they occupied was now an island surrounded by impassable torrents, and their only escape lay 30 feet above through the narrow well shaft. Can you climb it? Jackson asked April, peering up the dark shaft that led to daylight. I'll have to, she replied grimly. Jackson helped boost April into the shaft, where handholds cut into the stone walls provided a treacherous path upward. Next came Elijah, light enough for Jackson to lift most of the way before the boy's natural agility took over Dodd. As Jackson prepared for his own ascent, Vincent Blackwood's voice echoed from somewhere in the flooded passages. This isn't over, Avery. You think you've won, but you've only delayed the inevitable. I'll find another way. The voice cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of rushing water and falling stone. Martha Henderson's final defense had claimed its first victim, and Jackson felt no satisfaction in Vincent Blackwood's apparent fate. The climb up the well shaft tested every muscle in Jackson's body, but the thought of April and Elijah waiting above gave him strength. When he finally emerged into daylight, gasping and soaked, he found them surrounded by federal marshals led by Carter Smith. About time you showed up, Jackson said, accepting Carter's hand to pull him clear of the well. We've been here for an hour, Carter replied, waiting for the shooting to stop so we could move in safely. Looks like Martha Henderson had the last word after all. Jackson looked around at the scattered remains of Blackwood's force. Some captured, others fled. Their leader presumably drowned in the flooded passages beneath the house. Martha's legacy had protected them one final time, just as she had protected so many others 20 years before. 6 months later, Jackson stood on the front porch of their restored home, watching Elijah race across the yard with 3 other children from town. The boys' laughter carried on the spring breeze, a sound that never failed to lift Jackson's spirits and remind him of how far they traveled from that desperate morning when he gambled their last $500 on an abandoned farmhouse. The house itself bore little resemblance to the crumbling structure they'd first entered. Fresh paint gleamed white in the afternoon sun. The windows sparkled with new glass, and a carefully tended garden bloomed where weeds had once grown. But the most significant change wasn't visible from the outside. It was the sense of peace that pervaded the property. The feeling that old wounds had finally healed. April emerged from the kitchen, carrying a pitcher of lemonade and wearing the contented expression of a woman who had found her place in the world. Their wedding 3 months earlier had been a simple affair, conducted by the territorial circuit judge in the presence of the entire community. Even Henry Stiles had attended, though he was serving his sentence under house arrest and federal supervision. The delegation from the territorial capital should be here within the hour, April announced, settling into the rocking chair Jackson had built for her. "Are you ready for this?" Jackson touched the clean deed hanging in a frame beside the front door, a document that bore his name as sole owner of property that had been officially designated as a historical site by the territorial government. The transformation from desperate gamble to protected monument still amazed him. As ready as a man can be, I suppose. The formal dedication of the Martha Henderson Underground Railroad Museum had been planned for months, but Jackson still felt nervous about the attention it would bring. Reporters from 3 territorial newspapers were expected, along with representatives from the federal government and several prominent abolitionists who had traveled from as far as Boston to honor Martha's memory. Carter Smith arrived first, wearing his new badge as territorial deputy marshal and carrying a thick folder of documents. The legal proceedings against Vincent Blackwood's surviving conspirators had concluded successfully, resulting in prison sentences, financial restitution, and the complete exoneration of Jackson's family from any wrongdoing. "The final accounting," Carter announced, placing the folder on the porch table. "Every document Martha Henderson preserved has been cataloged and authenticated. The federal government's purchase offer stands at $12,000 for the historical materials, plus an annual stipend of $800 for maintaining the museum." Jackson shook his head in amazement. $12,000 was more money than he'd ever imagined possessing, enough to secure Elijah's future and establish the kind of stable life Sarah had always wanted for their family. But the money, important as it was, paled beside the other changes their discovery had brought. The territorial legislature had passed new laws, protecting historical sites and providing resources for documenting Underground Railroad activities. 3 other former stations have been identified and preserved, creating a network of monuments to courage that would educate future generations. Most personally satisfying was the scholarship fund established in Sarah's name, providing educational opportunities for children whose families couldn't afford regular schooling. Elijah had been the first recipient, though he would never need to leave home to receive an excellent education. April had been appointed as the museum's educational director, a position that allowed her to combine her love of teaching with her passion for historical preservation. "There's one more thing," Carter said, pulling a final document from his folder. "This came through federal channels yesterday." Jackson opened the official envelope to find a letter written on U.S. Marshal Service letterhead. The contents made his breath catch in his throat. "They're offering me a position," he told April, his voice filled with wonder. "Deputy U.S. Marshal, specializing in protecting historical sites and investigating crimes against federal property." April's smile could have lit the entire territory. "Are you going to accept?" Jackson looked around at the life they built together. The restored house, the thriving museum, the community that had welcomed them, and most importantly, his son's bright future stretching ahead like a promising road. "I think Martha Henderson would approve," he said finally. "Protecting places where freedom was born, making sure the stories get told properly. It feels like continuing her work in a different way." The sound of approaching carriages announced the arrival of the dedication ceremony guests. Jackson straightened. His new suit, the first formal clothing he'd owned since his wedding day, and prepared to welcome visitors to what had once been his desperate last hope. As the ceremony began, Jackson found himself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A widow's desperate gamble had uncovered a treasure that changed not just his family's life, but the understanding of an entire historical period. Martha Henderson's courage had inspired others to preserve and protect the sites where freedom had been won one family at a time. Elijah appeared at Jackson's side, wearing his own new suit and carrying the wooden horse his father had carved for him years earlier. The boy had insisted on bringing it to the ceremony, saying it represented all the journeys they'd taken together. "Papa, do you think Mama Sarah would be proud of us?" Elijah asked. Jackson knelt beside his son, straightening the boy's tie and seeing Sarah's gentle spirit shining in Elijah's eyes. "I think she'd be amazed at how much courage you've shown, how much you've learned, and how much good has come from our being here. And do you think Mama Martha is happy that her house is helping people again?" Jackson smiled, remembering the carved names on the chamber walls and the legacy of hope that had sustained them through their darkest moments. "I think Martha Henderson is very happy that her work is being remembered and honored. And I think she'd be especially proud that a little boy and his father found everything they needed right where she left it for them." As the dedication ceremony concluded and visitors toured the museum that had once been their secret refuge, Jackson stood with his new family and looked toward a future that seemed as bright and promising as the spring afternoon around them. Sometimes, he reflected, a man's desperate gamble led exactly where it was meant to go.